Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and right now we're looking at Sythis, Harvest's Hand, Enchantress. This deck comes to us from Felinar, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, and they said they're looking for general thoughts on the deck, and they've been trying to find better win cons. And they have no restrictions in building them. For sure, Felinar, we're going to take a look at the deck. And though I'm not going to suggest too many win cons because much like the end of an adventure, a kid's adventure movie, I'm going to tell you the win cons were already there the whole time. If you are interested in taking a look at this list, you can find it in the video description below. And I will note that lately it seems like we're inundated, my goodness, with green-white Enchantress decks. We just had a green-white-black pre-con with Commander Masters, and I believe our newest set, Wilds of Eldraine, came out with another green-white Enchantress deck. And I believe I heard online the two decks share quite a few cards. Interesting. An interesting thing, Wizards of the Coast, to do, considering the price of the decks is very, very different. However, that means if you want to get into Enchantress in Commander, which is a very, very fun and very strong archetype, I believe a lot of the pieces should be pretty cheap for you to pick up. So this is an ideal time to pick them up. And if I had a sponsor, I would direct you to their site right now. But while you are in the video description, please note there is a link to a form you can fill out so you can send me your own Commander deck list and I can take a look at it. And if you want your Commander deck to be the next one I make a video for, there's a link down there for that as well for your deck to skip the queue. Alright, so before we look into our Enchantress side, let's look at Sythis, Harvest's Hand. Who is Sythis and why is she basically the perfect Enchantress commander? Well, she's... Ooh, excuse me on my phone. Let me just give that a mute. Sythis is a green-white legendary nymph who is also an enchantment. Already good news. A 1/2 that says whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you gain 1 life and draw a card. I like commanders that are simple like this. She fills out a lot of things I really like. I love 2-mana commanders. I love, simple commanders that you know what you're working with. And I love card draw in the command zone. And Sythis offers all of these things for us. Notably, she's not a demigod. I wonder if it literally did not fit in the creature text. This is something they've mentioned before because she has the makings of a demigod of every other thing. She's chosen by a god. She's an enchantment creature. But all that aside, Sythis is incredibly powerful here, and we're going to just basically use her to play her on turn 2, and our goal is to go through as much of our deck as possible. So what does that look like? So let's look at our deck, and let's look at what we have. And I think this is a really, really good start-off base for our enchantment deck. You're playing basically everything most people would suggest you to play. And I think that's great. I think nothing standds out as a mistake, or, there's a few cards I'm going to harp on, but they're pretty low on that scale. Overall, the deck is pretty much there. And if we look at the curve, we can see that the curve is pretty straightforwardly strong. I will say there is 2 mana being the highest kind of mana cost of our deck is a bit tough. And usually we don't want that, those cards that match with our commander to, match our commander cost to be the highest number. But that's not really how this deck works. 99% of the cards are not as good if Sythis is not on the battlefield. So for what it's worth, Sythis is most likely going to be the first spell cast out of any 2-mana spell in the entire deck. So it's not too much of a problem. And like I said, I am going to suggest some 2-mana cards, actually maybe 2 or 3 of them. And with that in mind, don't worry too much about the mana cost there. I will note something about, let's go back to Sythis' beautiful picture and talk a little bit about something that I think this deck is kind of missing. I kind of alluded this at the start. Our deck builder is looking for finishers, but I actually think this may be a misplaced direction to be putting attention in the deck. So let's conceptualize Sythis for a second. You're playing a game of Commander. Let's say you don't play anything on the first turn. You play Sythis on turn 2. Now, Sythis is a beast, right? And how do we use her power to the maximum? Well, the idea comes behind playing as many enchantments per turn as possible, right? Because her power scales with the number of enchantments you play, and therefore to cards in hand and mana available. So for example, just as a quick kind of idea, if we play Sythis and we play a 3-drop, and then on the next turn and the turn after we play a 4-drop, we're actually using Sythis pretty badly, right? Because what we're doing is we're just giving the text of drawing an extra card per turn. That's not ideal. The real thing we want to do is on turn 3, we want to play like a 2-mana card and a 1-mana card, enchantment, I should say. Because that's going to put us draw 2 on that first turn, and then on the fourth turn, we want to play at least 2 spells, right? We want to play at least 2-mana spells, or a 3-mana and a 1-mana spell. The idea is that Sythis isn't good when she's drawing you 1 card a turn. Sythis is great when she is drawing you 2 or more cards a turn. And with that in mind, we need to adjust our ideas of our mana value for the deck and our mana base for the deck. I believe that 33 is just a little too low. I know that Sythis draws us so many cards that we can afford to be a lower mana base, but I still want you to hit at least 4 mana on the field, just in case you have some bad cycling through Sythis' ability, or if Sythis gets removed. Right now, if Sythis gets removed, you're in a really, really bad position. And I'm going to suggest that Sythis is very, very ideal to remove because she's just the linchpin holding the deck together. So with that in mind, I'd like you to at least go up to 35 lands. You're playing almost all of the lands that I would play in a deck like this, so just put either 2 more dual lands or 2 more basics, and I think you'll be pretty happy. But then the next thing I'm going to suggest is I'm going to suggest a handful of 1-mana spells, but I'm going to give the general suggestion that I want you to play as many 1-mana spells as possible. Some of them obviously are proactive and you're already playing them, like Burgeoning. You drop Burgeoning and you're very happy. Exploration, you play Exploration turn 1, you're very, very happy. But some of them you want to be maybe not reactive, or like you want to hold these abilities off until you have Sythis, so that you are casting, a 2-mana and a 1-mana spell on your 3rd turn, etc., etc. Especially, Burgeoning, Exploration, Carpet of Flowers, Wild Growth, Utopian Sprawl are all really, really good. We want to just have a few others that, a lot of these you'll just preemptively play. I want some that you can just hold up. And there's also a ton of 1-mana enchantment creatures. Maybe not a ton, but there's definitely a few that I think are worth playing. But I'll leave you to find some of those. But generally, the main idea is to think about the 1-mana drops and how strong they make the deck, and how they're going to allow you to keep a lower mana curve to begin with. There are some cards I would like to point out that I think kind of stand out. There's a bit of an angel package here. And I know Elesh Norn is not an angel, but I'm counting her in it. There's a bit of an angel package here that I'm a little less interested in, because though a lot of these, let's just go through them, right? Like Sigarda, Font of Blessings, is going to give everything hexproof. I understand why she's there, but that's the only text she has, right? Font of Blessings is an incredibly powerful creature. We did a Commander video on her recently. You can go check her out. But here we're just using her as a hexproof enabler, right? And we have better cards for that already. We already have Privileged Position. We already have, Sterling Grove. We have better in-theme cards to do these kind of things. So it feels strange to be playing Sigarda in this way, and therefore I'd like to cut her pretty easily. Our other Sigarda here, also in the same, in the same way, just is kind of expensive for this ability. I believe there is a creature from the original Zendikar, I think maybe Worldwake, but I could even be Rise, but has the same ability to stop your opponents from forcing you to sacrifice things. So I would play them before playing Sigarda here, because 5 mana for a 5/5 hexproof just isn't very, very good against this deck, or in this deck, and so I would cut that here for sure. I also would suggest, like, if this is the problem, like if your problem is your opponent is sniping your permanents, I don't know to what degree this is a solution. Like, all it does is open your deck up to board clears, because sometimes your opponents are going to have board clears and they're just not going to do anything, right? They're not going to want to board clear Sythis, but once you have Sigardas out, once you have other of these creatures, a board clear becomes much more, effective against you, and then they get to hold up all of that removal that was good against you and play it anyways. So this feels like a bit of a foolish endeavor to try to protect them. Avacyn, of course, in the same way, where Avacyn is giving everything indestructible, which is pretty good, but I don't think very relevant when it comes to creature removal. If you don't have Avacyn and Sigarda out at the same time, you're going to, you're still susceptible to Swords to Plowshares, to Path, certain board clears like Toxic Deluge, bounce spells. There's just a lot of things that still affect you, and in the meantime, you've spent 8 mana for an 8/8, which just doesn't feel ideal in the long run. Looking at everything else, let me see. I guess the other one was Shalai. I guess this is just a collection of angels that protect you, which is cool. I do like the flavoring of that. However, Shalai's putting +1/+1 counters on each creature isn't a real win con, and all of these cards are just kind of too much mana for what they do. So I would cut this entire top end of cards that I've mentioned. Likewise, Elesh Norn just feels out of place. if you watch my videos, I am a really big fan of this Elesh Norn, but I just don't think the -2/-2 on your opponent's creatures is a really, really strong card, but it does lose a lot of power when you can't also take advantage of the +2/+2 on your own creatures, which you kind of can't, because even if you're playing things like Verduran Enchantress, even if she's a 2/4, you're not attacking with her, really, unless the board is completely clear. So the change of, pumping these creatures isn't really going to do much, because your creatures are just so much more valuable on the defense. Yes, it works well with the Pegasi from Archon of Sun's Grace, but, even then, I think a flock of 2/2s with flying is fine on its own. They don't really need to be 4/4s. So Elesh Norn just kind of stands out as a kind of a strange inclusion, especially since we can't cheat her out. So I would put her on the cutting block as well, as much as it pains me to do so. Nyxbloom Ancient is great. I'm a big fan. I believe the rest are generally good. And otherwise, there's no enchantments or anything that strike me as a mistake. So overall, besides those cards, generally I do like the deck and I am pretty happy with it. So what are the cards I'd like to suggest? Well, let's start with the non-enchantment creatures, because I believe the non-enchantments, because I believe there's only 3. The first one is Eternal Witness. I think you'd just be pretty happy to have this card, because it can rebuy one of your win conditions, it can rebuy one of your enchantresses. It doesn't draw you a card with Sythis, but it does kind of draw you a card from your graveyard, which I think is a pretty good effect generally. Now, I have another card that I'm going to suggest that's just a little more expensive to do the same thing and a little trickier, but it is an enchantment. So Eternal Witness is the clean solution, but I'll give the other solution in a second. In the other two, I have 2 win conditions, and one of them I don't like, but I thought I'd suggest it anyways, because this is kind of like if you like that Elesh Norn effect, if you like that Shalai effect, I think this is just better. I don't particularly love this effect in your deck, but if you really do like how it plays with your enchantments that create tokens, and you want that kind of effect, I think Celestial Ancient will just do the job a lot better. where you can just, after the second or third enchantment, it's bigger than Elishnorn in terms of the boost it's given your board, and you can do a lot more than 2 or 3 enchantments with this out. And the fact that it grows itself, unlike Elishnorn, I think is still worth playing, and it'll be able to, you know, at least jump in for a lot of damage very quickly, which I do really like. So this would be my suggestion over the other choices if you want this kind of effect. And I think it's fine. I think this effect is fine. So playing the first one isn't too bad. The other one is kind of a little sneakier, and it's Aetherflux Reservoir. I think this card would be very, very good in your deck. Not only do you actually gain meaningful life over time, because every single one of your spells gain you 1 life, then when you have this out, your ability to churn through your deck is really, really good, so you should be gaining quite a bit of life on each of your turns. Now, I mentioned the first part of gaining 1 life at a time, even though that's not ideally how you want to use this card. It's important to get past that initial 50, right? You want to be able to cast this card, and if someone tries to remove it, you can nuke them for 50 damage, right? And in order to do that, you need to either, because they're going to beast within this at instant speed, right? So with that in mind, you want to already be above 51, and I think our commander allows us to do that. So I think this is a really neat, both aggressive and defensive option for the deck. It will turn you into arch enemy when you play it, so make sure to play this on a turn that you can cast multiple spells right after, but I think it's a very, very fun inclusion. All right, now let's start looking at enchantments. Let's start looking at our 2-mana enchantments first, and then just a few 1-mana enchantments. So Wolf Willow Haven is kind of like mana ramp at 2 mana. This was suggested to me as thinking of it as a 1-mana card, and I don't necessarily disagree. The idea is that if you play this outside of turn 1 with an addition, or turn 1 or turn 2, you enchant a land with it and immediately get a mana back, so it feels like it's a 1-mana land. I don't necessarily disagree with it. I think that sentiment is fine. It is mana ramp and it is an enchantment. I think you're going to have a good time with that, and it is the most boring of the choices. So let's look at some things a little more interesting. And the first one being that the card that I feel like is always missing in these decks, and that's Rest in Peace. I've just suggested Eternal Witness, and I'm going to suggest another graveyard card, but I will suggest this every day. You should absolutely play this in your Enchantress deck. This is one of the strongest cards you can play in a game of Commander, because certain decks will just stop working, right? We might say that someone shows up with a Dredge style deck or a pure reanimation deck, and you're going to play this, and if they're not in the right colors and can't remove it, the game is just over for them, right? If I show up with Aristocrats and you play Rest in Peace, the game is mostly done for me. I myself build decks so that I can get rid of these kind of effects, but if I don't draw into them, if the game doesn't go my way, I'm basically out, where my main way of defeating my opponents has just been robbed from me, right? So that's already strong, but I'm not even counting all of the incidental, power this card has. Because this card gets rid of, as mentioned, Eternal Witness effects no longer work. Any form of returning lands from the graveyard don't work. But also any kind of general, not themed, but general recursion no longer works. If you're playing against black opponents, chances are they're playing at least one reanimation spell, because it's one of the benefits to be in those colors. But in addition, you can think of cards like Feign Death. You can think of cards, that just have some nice abilities that interact with the graveyard in an unexpected way. You can think of cards with Delve. You can think of cards with Dredge to return it to your hand. You can think of, there's a lot of cards that count the number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard. And all of those cards just no longer work from this point on when Rest in Peace is in play. And I think that's just so powerful. And yes, it can make you a target, but oftentimes the players that would target you for this just can't really deal with it, and they can't really deal with you now that Rest in Peace is play. We've looked at a Marchesa of the Black Rose deck a few times recently, and this card is another type of card that's just so good against that kind of strategy. So I just think you can never go wrong playing this card in your deck. It's just a beast. Especially since it's just getting reprinted with that beautiful art. Absolutely pick up a copy. Pick up 10 copies, honestly. Put it in every white deck that is not a graveyard deck, and you will be very, very happy. Another white kind of defensive card before we look at the recursion card is Aegis of Gods. Aegis of the Gods. I just like this card. It's going to be a meta decision. This card can either be okay or it can be just really, really, really good. Certain decks, certain, certain strategies will just kind of fold to this, and that's worth considering. I'm thinking things like Mill, I'm thinking things like certain burn decks, I'm thinking things like certain curse decks, any black or red target opponent cards, a lot of blue kind of really, really strong enchantments that steal things from you. Aegis of the Gods just kind of stops all of that, and with Sythis out, it cycles. So I think it's a pretty low cost inclusion into a deck like this, and though it's not always going to be ideal, I think in certain situations you're going to be very, very happy with the results. All right, here is my recursion suggestion, and this is Shigeki Jukai Visionary. And I think both modes of this card are particularly strong. I think the fact that you can use this to just try to ramp a little bit is nice, but of course the main idea is that you should be reading as Shigeki, you play them, you draw a card off Sythis or any other Enchantress, and then for 2 mana you bounce it back into your hand. You can kind of, almost ignore the second half of it at a certain point. It does throw the rest of the cards in the graveyard, but the main goal would be to put it back into your hand and then play it again, drawing a bunch again. But the other, of course, really strong part of Shigeki is the fact that you can discard them to channel and in an uncounterable way most of the time, put a bunch of your cards from your graveyard into your hand. Now, this is an expensive ability. It is 4 for one card, 6 for another, so on and so forth. And they have to be non-legendary cards. But at a certain point in the game, you're going to be pretty happy with this effect, especially considering it can't be countered. It's at instant speed. You can hold up mana for a turn cycle, use it on your last opponent's end step, grab a bunch of cards, redeploy them, and get back into a winning advantage. So with all in mind, I do really, really like this card. I think it is really cool. It does sometimes do nothing. It is kind of a 1/3 that does nothing, but so do these other 2 mana cards that I've suggested. Sometimes they're just not going to do anything. I think you play in a deck like this that has such a high ability to draw through its deck and play multiple cards, you're okay with cards that at their base just cycle, and you'll be really happy with something like this. All right, the next few cards are kind of more straightforward. They are 1 mana cards. Abundant Growth is just one that's missing here, and I'm gonna have this as a hold, look at this card and just imagine every other 1-drop you possibly can. Any 1-drop, in our colors, there's some enchantment creatures, there's just auras, there's 1 mana enchantments. I see that you're playing pretty good, like your budget is pretty high, so even cards like Authority, let's see, there it is, Authority of the Consuls. We're going to be very, very happy to play a card like this, because if nothing, it'll slow down our opponents and it'll keep you in the lead, but it's also just a 1 mana, enchantment card. Cards like these, just as you play them, you're going to just be really, really happy to cycle through your deck and just draw more and more cards. They work great with Sythis. They work great with Sigil of the Empty Throne. They work great with Archon of Sun's Grace. These are your finishers, by the way. I think I kind of skipped over that in all of this. Your finisher is Sigil of the Empty Throne and Archon of the Sun's Grace. You might say, Curse, that doesn't feel like enough finishers. It is enough finishers. I guarantee the power of these cards. You have Hallowed Haunting is another copy, and if you really wanted, there are a few more cards that have this kind of effect of Constellation playing creatures. One of them being cards that turn your enchantments into creatures, though I don't like that as much. But I would say just playing the 2 already of, where are they? Sigil of the Empty Throne and, where are they? Archon of Sun's Grace. I think that's already more than enough. I like Sigil obviously more because it survives a board wipe, but you have the means to protect this card, right? You're gonna spend the first little part of the game just basically, you know, setting up. Luminarch Ascension is another one for sure, but you're gonna just be setting up your defenses, setting up your draw engines, and then when you're able to either have Privileged Position out or where are you? Sterling Grove out, then you're gonna play Sigil of the Empty Throne, and then you're gonna start playing Angels, right? And you're gonna make sure if you lose the Sigil, you'll have the means of getting it back using Eternal Witness or Shigeki, and if they wipe the board and get rid of your Angels, you're just going to start it all over again because your deck has more than a third of it is designed to create Angels with this card, right? So you're going to have a really, really nice time with just using this card as your finisher. And having a bunch of 1 mana cards is going to be incredibly helpful because though I do really, really like, where are we? The Luminarch Ascension. You know what's cheaper than 2 mana for a 4/4? 1 mana for a 4/4. And I think you're just going to have a really good time with those cards. So to kind of answer your question from the start, and as I mentioned before, the win conditions are already inside the deck. You know, you can use these cards. You just need to be careful how you use them. This isn't a deck where you can just vomit out your hand and have no problems. You need to do a little planning. You need to do a little figuring out before you get there. All right, I have 2 last 1 mana enchantments I'd like to suggest. And these are kind of like the cards I like, and I'm going to I'm going to make my arguments for them. Curse of Silence is already a card that I think is generally good in white decks. What does this card do? This card says one of your opponent's commanders starts with commander tax. And then when they cast it, you draw a card. I think this is really, really good. I think one is a layaway cycling card where you will eventually draw the card. And if you don't, it means that player has been knocked out of the game and either you've lost the game as well or you're winning the game and you don't mind. So I think that's pretty low stakes to play a card like this. But on the positive side, you can kind of, you know, slow down one of your opponents. Like, think of how good this card is against this very deck, right? You play this, Sythis immediately costs 4. You remove Sythis, and I don't think you even sacrifice this card. You just leave it in play, and Sythis now costs 6. Like, that's really, really good. I think that's something also worth considering and not talked about all the time is that you don't also always want to sacrifice this card. The free 2 extra mana to cast that card sticks around, and therefore it just becomes like a permanent command tax, and that can really knock a commander out of the zone of being playable incredibly quickly. If you think about the idea that as certain decks are able to create 2 mana a turn, which means they can just keep up with the fact that they are, you know, they are behind. They can just keep casting their commander over and over again. But if you throw Curse of Silence in, even not from the start of the game, but somewhere in the middle, all of a sudden that math gets wonky and they might give up on the idea altogether, which I think is particularly strong. And the last thing I'll say about this, obviously I very much like this card, is that there is an argument I make for Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. And the argument is that if we want to know how good Thalia is, we should be counting the amount of mana she is taxing your opponents. And I would suggest Curse of Silence can fall into a similar situation, where the longer we leave this on the battlefield, the more mana it objectively drains from your opponents. Like, if your opponent plays this card, plays their commander once, and they've paid the 2 extra tax, and then it's removed, and then they pay it again, this 1 mana has cost your opponent 4 mana. And I think that's really, really good. And at that point, you can decide if you're done with it and you just want to cycle for the next card, or you want to leave this in play forever. All this to say, I think Curse of Silence is just a really, really strong card. And here in this deck, it is a 1 mana enchantment. You're probably not going to play it on the first turn. And there's going to be times that you're going to play this and it's going to be too late, like all of your opponent's commanders are out already. But that still is good in general because it works with your commander deck, but also like Curse of Silence doesn't get worse because your opponent's commanders are on the field. A board clear is coming, removal is coming eventually, and so this will come into play. And what can I say? It's like Drannith Magistrate. Drannith Magistrate doesn't stop being good. Now, Drannith Magistrate does a lot more, but Drannith Magistrate doesn't stop being good against commanders when all the commanders are out. The threat of what it represents is strong enough by itself that I think it's worth playing. Okay, I think I did have one more thing to say. For what it's worth, you can name non-commander cards with this card, right? And you do have several good hits a lot of the time. You can play this or use this to play around common counter magic, common removal, common board clears. If everyone is green at the table and you are concerned with your enchantments being Beast Within, you can say Beast Within. It is a reasonable thing to do. Is it going to be ideal all the time? No, because you're not guaranteeing it in a format that you can guarantee this ability, but it is something to consider. All right, one other card that I think is interesting and worth playing is Spreading Algae. Spreading Algae is a land destruction, repeatable 1-mana spell against specifically swamps. Now, there's two ways to play this. The first way is that you use this with Urborg. Let me just bring up Urborg. Urborg is a land that makes all lands swamps. It is also specifically not a black card. It doesn't have or in the color identity, it does not have a black mana symbol on it because it itself makes itself a swamp and then can tap for black mana, which is personally really, really cool. But this means you can play it out of black commander decks. So you could use this in addition to Spreading Algae in order to start just destroying all of it, like you're targeting your opponent's lands, and then you can target any land with this. I'm going to say that's not really necessary. You're already playing a very strong card, which is Carpet of Flowers, that is dependent on your opponents having islands, and Spreading Algae just needs your opponents to have swamps. I would say it's likely in a 4-person pod that someone is playing black. It's not 100% happening, but it is just one card in your deck. The downside is you can't cast this without a swamp in play. Oh, I don't know why that scrolled. You can't cast this without a swamp in play, which is kind of rough, whereas at least Carpet of Flowers you can cast even if it does nothing. But the ceiling of this card isn't bad. It is like pseudo land destruction. Even if they never tap that land, it does mean that they're 1 mana shorter than they would usually be. And ideally, if they do tap that land, you get this card back, you get to cast it again, triggering all your Enchantresses again, all your Constellation again, and at that point, you're very far ahead. So I do really, really like this card, and I think it is a very nice inclusion to your deck. Speaking of conclusion, I'm going to conclude. I like this Sythis deck. I think it's very strong. It's very much so on its means to get to where it wants to be. My suggestions are your Angels being your high mana protection spells and finishers isn't really working. In fact, Elish Nord as a finisher doesn't really make sense, and I would probably take the lot of them out. In addition, I would try to add 2 more lands and increase the number of low mana enchantments, specifically ones that are 1 mana, because Sythis really, really benefits from having as many 1 mana enchantments as you possibly can. This is a pseudo storm/combo deck. The more spells you cast, the more likely you are to win. And so, giving yourself the means to cast more spells is of the utmost importance. You've seen my suggestions. If any of them pique your interest, I would put them in. And if you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, I would love to see it. Like I said at the start of the video, Enchantress is very popular right now, and I can see why. It is a very fun deck archetype, and much like, it reminds me a lot of Blink, where you're just getting more and more advantage, and your opponents have to work really hard to stop you because there's such a straightforward power level in your deck. with that in mind, I think I just said it, but I'll say it again. I'd love to see another draft of this deck. If you'd like to send me a draft of this deck or any deck, you can find a link in the video description below. And if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very grateful. The YouTube thing is very helpful for the channel, and we are trying to reach as many people as possible. In addition, when you send me any of the decks, if you want your deck to be the next deck I look at, there is a link for that in the video description as well, so we can make it so your deck is the next video that comes out. All right, I look forward to seeing more Sythis and more enchantment decks. And I will admit that I am a little interested in seeing a few more 3-color or more enchantment decks, because I like Sythis, but she's very easily the strongest. So if other people have other Enchantress decks they would like me to take a look at, then maybe the Abzan ones, or Bant is really fun, I'd love to take a look. But in the meantime, good luck improving this deck. I love Sythis. I wish there was a better version of her for Modern, but otherwise she's very, very good. Yeah, good luck.